I appreciate your coming, and I hope I can give you an hour or so of interesting stuff. It isn't a lot of time to teach you anything in great detail, so I'm going to try to do sort of more of an overview. More just want to give you the feel for trusted computing in the industry in general. I would certainly like to encourage you guys to ask questions throughout. I'm going to try to cover a lot of material in a short period of time, so we'll see how it all works out. So the topic today, as Marv mentioned, is trusted computing, and the way that I'd like to start, I guess, first is with a couple of definitions. So before I do any talking, actually, I wanted to open this up to the audience and ask, what do you guys think trust is? What is trust? Anyone have a definition for me? Anything? Okay, well, I will give you some definition. So from Webster, trust may mean to have confidence in something, to rely or depend on confidently. Trust often is about the future, so it's reliance on something in the future. And a related word, entrust, is to place in the care of another. And the definition that I think is most important for this discussion is that when you trust someone or something, that entity that you trust is in a position to do you harm. And I wanted to dispel a little bit the notion when we're talking about trusted computing that you only trust good things or things that you believe are good. Trust is really about reliance. So, we all are forced to trust that the government is going to do good things for our country. That doesn't mean that everybody believes that that's going to happen, but that's really what trust is all about. So, the question to ask is, well, do you trust your computer? And I would say the answer that most people would give is no. It's really difficult. It's really difficult to make a computer that's secure where you really know what it's doing all the time. So let me give you a definition for trusted computing. So trusted computing is the use of a computer where there is confidence that the computer will behave as expected. And trusted computing is really becoming much more important today as people are increasingly putting information out there, in a number of forms. So on servers, your credit card companies and Facebook and MySpace, all have information about you. You put information in your cell phone, your PDA, your computer. All of these things really make the need to understand what your computers are doing important. So let me talk about the goals of trusted computing. My focus and a lot of my background is with the Trusted Computing Group, which is an industry consortium standards organization that's defining technologies for trusted computing, and that's what I'll spend a lot of this talk talking about. So according to the Trusted Computing Group, the goal is to help users protect their information assets. So we're talking about your data, your passwords, cryptographic keys from compromise. And the primary attackers that we're worried about are external software, viruses, that kind of thing, as well as physical theft of your machines. But there are others who have been very opposed to the trusted computing initiatives in general. When the TCPA came out, which was the precursor to TCG, there was an article by Richard Stallman who called it treacherous computing. And the argument was that what you're doing is enabling your computer to lock you out. So in other words, your computer doesn't trust you, only those people out in the, Microsoft and those people can control your computer. So there are a couple of different ways to look at what trusted computing is. And I'm not going to tell you what you should believe, not that it would do any good if I did. But really, I just kind of want to show you guys some of the arguments, and you can make your own determination. So I argue that trusted computing is about control and validation. So when we're talking about trusting people, it's more about interpersonal relationships. It's kind of fuzzy. It's, I know this person. I don't think he's going to do anything bad. In computing, it really is much more precise. And the trust is about, can I control with confidence what my computer is doing? And can I validate that what it's doing is actually the right thing? So first, I'll just mention user-centric trust. And this is what a lot of people would call the good trust. So if trusted computing allows you to control what your computer does, I think you'd be pretty happy. And it's helpful if you can validate your bank's website. You want to know when I'm online, I'm talking to the right people. It's not a phishing attack, that kind of thing. Maybe you want to be able to validate other machines. So if you want to send information to your friends, you want to know I'm talking to that friend and not to some hacker. And in some cases, you want to be able to unambiguously prove who you are. So there's an online persona. You're trying to get online, but you want people to know this is you, and nobody can spoof you. So, and then there's the kind of trust that many are trying to fight, which is third-party trust. So instead of you being the one who controls and validating, it's other people are getting the control and validating. So my bank can validate my computer. Now that's probably a good thing, right? You want the bank to be able to know this is Ari Singer doing his transaction. I certainly want that, so that nobody else is doing this transaction. But maybe there's software vendors who can provide services based on what's going on in your machine. So now, if you want to use, some application, the software provider says, well, you can only do it on this machine, and you can only do it in this window of time, and only when you're running certain kinds of software. So, again, Microsoft is the favorite company for people to bash. So, you can only get these great services if you're running a genuine Microsoft operating system. If you want to run Linux or something else, forget about it. Trusted computing, the potential of it is to give these kinds of capabilities. Another one which, and I use, a big buzzword in the industry, which is digital rights management, DRM. People cringe whenever they hear that. But, the idea is maybe my music provider says, you can only listen to your music on this machine, and you can't put it on any other machine. You can't run it with any other software. So it's really a control issue. And then the last bullet is the one that I think has hindered trusted computing the most, which is that third parties can unambiguously identify you. So I don't know if you are familiar, but a number of years back, Intel tried to put a uniquely identifying number, serial number on people's PCs, and there was a huge backlash, and basically they pulled right out of that. And the reason is that they didn't want third parties to be able to know exactly what machine people are running. And trusted computing has the same potential issue where, and I'll talk about this in a minute, you have a security chip, and it has unique cryptographic keys on it that could potentially identify you. So I've given you kind of the good and the bad about trusted computing. So let me talk a little bit about, in more detail, about really what it is that I'm talking about. I also want to give you a sense here when I talk about the ecosystem of just how complex and interwoven this all is. So I'm going to focus on PCs. That's what the trusted computing group has matured the most. But this is, again, just specific to PC platforms. So you have a PC, and embedded on your PC is a motherboard. And one of the most important, the big new additions is there's this chip called the TPM, Trusted Platform Module, that's physically embedded on the motherboard. So it's actually part of your system. It's available today on almost all commercial platforms, not so much for consumer platforms, but on commercial PCs, you'll almost always find one of these chips there. There's security software that's running in the pre-boot environment, so before you've booted up into your operating system, there's stuff going on. There's an integration of peripherals, external devices. Many of them are authentication devices, so smart cards, biometrics, USB tokens. Your hard drive, there are initiatives to encrypt your hard drives and make them more secure. And then the operating system has to get involved. From there, there's middleware. So the TSS is the TCG software stack. That's what the company that I used to work for built. And connected to this middleware are a number of applications. More recently, there have been initiatives, Intel's Trusted Execution Technology, TXT, as an example of this, where there's hardware process isolation. So built right down onto your motherboard is a way for you to run certain applications or certain code that's completely separate from all the other code that's running on your machine. So then you have these measured operating systems. And then also trying to secure the connection from these environments to remote machines. And so the TCG, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but just to kind of give you a flavor for the industry, the TCG has working groups for defining what the TPM does, how it works. There are already some standards for that. They're working on the next generation version as well. There's a PC client working group, and there's one for each platform. So this defines, what does the TPM look like on a platform? How is it embedded on there? What are the trusted properties on a PC? There's a TSS working group to define the software interface to the devices. Infrastructure working group, which defines what the protocols are across networks. And storage working group. Trusted Network Connect, so defining how you can prove that your machine is the correct machine and in the correct state across the network. Dynamic root of trust for measurement, which I'll briefly talk about a little bit later, but it's basically how to improve the security of these virtualized environments. And then an authentication working group, which helps define how users can better authenticate and use these technologies. Okay. Any questions so far? I didn't think so. Quiet audience, but please jump in at any time if you have a question. So the Trusted Platform Module is the central technology, the new concept that is really being pushed into the commercial space now. So a TPM, it's a hardware security device, as I mentioned. It's embedded on a platform. For those of you who are interested in sort of how things are laid out, I'll just talk very briefly. It's got some non-volatile storage for long-term storage of keys. It has platform configuration registers, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, that basically store measurements of software. It has a notion of attestation identity keys. These are ways for you to prove who you say you are. It's got program code. It has a random number generation, hash algorithm, cryptographic key generation. RSA is the public key algorithm of choice. There's a notion of opt-in, which I'll talk about a little bit, which has its pluses and minuses, and an execution engine. So let me just sort of summarize what the key features are that the TPM does. So it's a secure repository for a hierarchy of cryptographic keys. The reason it's a hierarchy is when you're putting a security chip or anything on a motherboard, you want to keep it as inexpensive as possible. And so what the designers of the TPM did was create it so that there are certain core core keys that are stored on the device itself, and everything else is encrypted and stored off of the machine, and that's done through a hierarchy. So one key encrypts the next key, which encrypts the next key, etc. Secure reporting of measured state, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Enforcement of access control. Access control on cryptographic keys and protected data. So, one of the things that the TPM does is when you have a key, only in a certain kind of situation will you be able to actually use that key. And then it performs the hardware. It's hardware protected cryptographic operations, so it actually does the encryption and digital signing and that kind of thing. So the first concept to understand is the root of trust. So what you want to do is, what you have to do is get to a point where the first thing that happens is trusted. That you believe that the first thing that happens is legitimate. If you can compromise that very first operation, there's really no technology that can help you. So the idea of the root of trust is the vendors in the industry put a lot of effort into making the root of trust very secure, and everything else is bootstrapped off of that and built up off of that. So these trusted building blocks are very hard to defeat, and then everything after that just inherits the security from these trusted building blocks, these roots of trust. So there are three key roots of trust that are intrinsically related to the TPM. Two of them exist within the TPM. One is on the platform. So the root of trust for storage is in the TPM, and what that means is that you have certain keys and certain information that is on this chip and protected, so that if someone wants to get at it, they'd actually physically have to drill into this chip to get access to it. Root of trust for reporting means it holds certain information that it's received, and it will only release that information in a certain way and under certain conditions. And then the root of trust for measurement is a very important part of this, which I'll touch on all of this later. I just want to introduce the concept. Is where you measure the software that's being run on your machine, and you pass that information into the TPM. And so the very first piece of code you want to make sure is measured properly, so that all the code that's run after you can trust is actually what is running on that platform. Okay, so let me get into a couple of the details about access control. So TPMs enforce access control policy on data and keys, as I mentioned, and there's sort of four key ways that it does that. One is through user passwords or user secrets. So you enter a password. If it's the correct password, the TPM will perform the operation you want. Another is through this measured software state, which I'll be talking about in a minute. So only if the correct software is running on your machine will the TPM do the operation. There's a concept of the TPM owner, which is really actually just another password. It's just a special password. But basically, the owner controls certain aspects of what the TPM will do and when and how it will do it. And the last is privileged access. So built onto the platform where the TPM is, there may be certain components of hardware that have access to resources inside the TPM that, for instance, software would not have. Okay, so let me give you somewhat technical, tried to make it as easy as possible, but a somewhat technical example of using passwords. So there's a concept of sealing. If you're familiar with public key cryptography, the idea is you have a private key which is stored in one place and a public key which can be released to all external parties. So there's a sealing private key, priv-k, which never leaves the TPM. And then the TPM itself actually uses the sealing public key to seal the secret data to itself. And the idea is that you encrypt data that can only be decrypted by the TPM. So in a lot of these cases, you have all of this data that's encrypted, and it's sitting right there on your hard drive, and it's the TPM that allows you to actually get access to that data. So just define a couple of parameters for you. There's something called TPM proof. This is one of the few long-term secrets that the TPM keeps. This is something that's never revealed outside of the TPM. There's a seal authorization, seal auth. So that's the user secret. So when you want to seal data to a TPM, you say, here's the password that I'm giving you, and the TPM will not decrypt that secret unless the seal auth is correct. Pub-k and priv-k are the public-private key pair, and data is the data to be sealed. Yeah?
So what happens if the TPM goes bad?
If the TPM goes bad, then essentially you lose your trust. If you mean the TPM no longer functions.
Yeah, and the data is encrypted.
That's right. Yeah, so in practice, and really the way most systems work, is you have to have backup mechanisms. You have to have other ways of storing the data. In some cases, you seal something. So I'll give you the case of your typical laptop, right? So I seal the encryption key from my hard drive to the TPM. I also put that key on a USB stick somewhere, or back it up. If I'm at an enterprise, maybe I'm backing it up to a server someplace. I squirrel it away. I don't need to carry it with me, okay? But I have that key backed up. So when I'm walking around with my laptop, the key isn't sitting there anywhere except inside my TPM. If my TPM dies, I have to go back to my IT department, or I have to go get my USB token or something to retrieve that key to decrypt the hard drive. So a necessary element to a TPM is that there has to be a backup mechanism. You use it to improve your security, but you also have to be able to recover. Okay, so, and then just in very simple terms, the TPM sealed data blob takes as inputs, and I'm simplifying all of this, so it takes as inputs the data you want to seal and the user's password. And what comes out of that is the public key encryption of the data, the password that you gave it, and also this TPM proof value. And that gets written out to disk. And then when you want to retrieve this, you do a TPM unseal. And in that command, you provide the sealed data and your password. And that's it. So it does a private key operation. It retrieves data, TPM proof, and the seal auth. And then it checks that the password you provided is correct. It checks that TPM proof is there, which is very important. And if both of those are validated, then it outputs the data. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is the storage of measurements. And this is, a lot of the stuff that I've talked about, keeping cryptographic keys and having passwords that, authorize access to those keys. That's all well known and it's been used for a long time. Really, measurements is the new, big important advancement that trusted computing is, that the industry has been trying to achieve. So I show this just to remind people how a hash function works. So basically, you have some large amount of data, and it can be of any different size. And there's a one-way function that converts that data to a much smaller, in this case, 20-byte value. So the idea is that you can take data and verify that this is the data you started with, but you can't go back from the data, from this, to determine what this value is. So as I started to mention before, the TPM contains platform configuration registers, PCRs. And the PCRs are each 20 bytes, and they store measurements. Each measurement is built on the previous one using these cryptographic hashes. So if you know the inputs, you can reconstruct, check that the PCR value is correct, but you can't go backwards. And I'll tell you what measurements are exactly in a minute. But so each PCR, and on a PC, I think there are 24 PCRs stored on a TPM on a PC. Each one holds a 20-byte value X sub I. And the way it's constructed is when you want to extend PCR I with some piece of code, so we're talking about something that you're going to actually execute, you would do a hash of X sub I, so the previous value of your PCR, with a hash of the code that you want to run. And the idea is that if you've measured the code before you run it, and you say, only when this code is running do you get access to the key, then if somebody comes in and changes your software somehow, this calculation is going to come out differently, and the TPM won't have the same value in its PCR. So let me give a little more concrete example of this. So this is the idea of chaining trust. So at the bottom, so here's the TPM. At the bottom, I'm showing the core root of trust for measurement. So this is the very first thing that runs when you boot up your PC. The next thing is the BIOS. The BIOS may allow option ROMs to execute. After that, it passes control to the master boot record. I apologize, you may not be able to read that. And then the master boot record passes control to the OS loader, which will bring up your operating system. Okay, so the CRTM starts the trust chain. If you break the CRTM or you don't trust the CRTM, all bets are off. And each process measures the next process before releasing execution control to that process. And the TPM simply records each measurement as they're passed to it. So it's actually a passive entity in this process. And it's only the use of this state that actually is important with the TPM's involvement. So the first thing the CRTM does, and this is actually specified and being done today in a number of PCs. So the core root of trust for measurement comes up. It's written by the PC OEMs, so you can assume it's well behaved. So the first thing it does is it reports what it is. So there's nothing measuring the CRTM. It just measures itself, or it says, this is, I am who I say I am. So it does an extend operation, and some PCR, we'll just call it PCR A, is modified. Okay? And then the CRTM measures the BIOS. So it reads the code that it's about to pass execution to, and it does an extend operation to the TPM, and PCR B is modified. Okay? So before the BIOS can do anything, whether it's a good BIOS or a bad BIOS, the TPM already knows which BIOS is being run on that machine. So the CRTM passes execution control to that BIOS. It does whatever operations it's going to do. And then the BIOS will measure, and again, these are all compliant things. You can imagine there are a number of vendors involved in this process who have to write all these different pieces of code to do this stuff. The BIOS measures each option ROM that it's going to allow to execute. Again, it reads the option ROM code before it passes control. It extends it into PCRC in this case. Then it passes execution control to the option ROM. At some point, the option ROM will return control to the BIOS. Now, when those are all done, the BIOS is going to go measure the master boot record. And it's the same process over again. It measures, it extends, the PCR is modified, it passes execution control, and so forth. Okay? Now, I show it ending here for a reason, which is in today's world, once you get to the OS loader, after that, all bets are off. One of the things you have here is these values are specific to every single bit and byte of all of the previous code that's been running before. And there is a hope that that stuff doesn't change very often. In reality, it does change, which has its own host of problems for how you transition from one set of pre-boot code to another. But here's really where, in today's world, when you're chaining your trust up from boot, that you really can't get any more information about what's running, because the OS is changing every minute. So let me give a concrete example. I've been talking a lot of abstractions. So a concrete example of this, and really my favorite example that I use to explain the power of trusted computing is Microsoft BitLocker. Now, I'm not endorsing that as a product. I'm not saying you want to use it. I'm just saying that it's a good example of how trusted computing technology can improve the security of a platform. So one of the things that BitLocker was designed to solve is this classic problem of, I've left my laptop in the back of a cab. Oh no, I don't know who got it. I don't know what's happening to my data. And this happens, you hear news stories about this all the time. The CEO of X company had all of the financial information and secrets and, whatever, and their laptop was stolen. And in traditional Windows systems, hard drives might be compromised simply by booting into another OS. So, the typical thing someone would do, I found a laptop, pull the hard drive out, boot into Linux or some other operating system, plug that hard drive in, go in. You know what Microsoft OS looks like. You go change the user's password, you go log in, and you have full access. Okay, even without knowing the password. So one of the things that BitLocker does when the TPM is used is the key that encrypts your hard drive is inside your TPM. Okay, so the first thing is, if you try to pull the hard drive out and put it in another machine, it's not going to help you because the key's not there. You're just going to see an encrypted hard drive. And the other thing is that going back to this root of this chain of trust, which ended at the OS loader, which in this case is a Microsoft-specific OS loader, you can only get access to this key in the TPM when you've booted all the way up to Windows. Once you're in Windows, you can't do all of these clever attacks to go modify things. So in fact, what you have is you have a TPM-protected key where the TPM is enabling you to check which OS you're running and check the user's password. So now an attacker who steals a laptop simply is forced to guess the user's password. And actually, TPMs have built-in controls to prevent people from fast guessing. So the more times you guess the wrong password, the TPM starts to slow down and it won't respond to you. So this is a really good practical way of using trusted computing technology to defeat real-life attacks. Great place for a question. Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question. What if you're one of those people who likes dual-boot machines and you like to run some things on Linux or maybe a Mac emulator?
Right.
Then what happens?
Yeah, so it's a technical challenge to make sure that there isn't too much changing in that common code that's exposed to both operating systems. But BitLocker, and just speaking for that technology in particular, it's actually defined to encrypt a particular volume. So you may have one volume which is encrypted with this TPM key that you won't be able to get access to if you boot into your other OS. But there's nothing stopping you. I mean, in any of this, there's nothing stopping you from changing any of this stuff or loading a different OS loader. The only issue is you're not going to be able to get access to that key that gives you access to your Windows partition. So essentially, what you have in a dual boot environment is just two separate, you can almost look at it as two separate computers, one that runs Linux sometimes and one that runs Windows. Yeah?
Well, the other question, of course, is the whole movement toward the virtualization of operating systems, which is happening on laptops also,
Mm-hmm.
so that you wind up with having a multitude, possibly. So are any of the efforts of standardization here directed in those areas of how to handle the virtual environment?
Yes, and that's a great segue, maybe not to this slide, but hold that thought. A couple slides up, yes, I will talk about that a little bit. But the short answer is yes. Okay. All right, so let me hit another one of the access control mechanisms in the TPM. So this is privileged access. So there are a couple of different kinds of privileged access. One is what we call physical presence, where there's some notion that there's actually a person physically sitting at the computer doing something as opposed to some remote script that's running. There's a notion of locality. So locality uses the concept of where the software is running. So on a PC platform, locality may refer simply to an address space. So there are certain ways to get access to the chip. If you're in an OS present environment, in Windows, for instance, you always have to go in through locality 0. It's just that's the address space that's allocated to contact the chip. There may be privileged code that's running on that platform that can access different localities, and the TPM can distinguish between which locality a command is coming in on. And then there's a concept of a dynamic root of trust for measurement, which, for lack of time, I'm not going to get into too much detail. But the idea is this. When I showed the earlier example of booting from the core root of trust for measurement to the BIOS, et cetera, that's only when you boot. You only get one shot at it. Application writers and other people really can't take advantage of any of that because you have to get down into these early parts of code that's running on a machine that you don't really want a lot of people to have access to. Dynamic root of trust for measurement is the concept that the platform uses locality to measure new code that's running in an isolated process. So the DRTM, which is the dynamic root of trust for measurement, again, this is a hardware component that's built onto your motherboard. It gains control upon execution of some specific CPU instruction. It will measure, extend, and then execute the measured launch environment. So, the idea is you have some special operating system or some special code that runs that it's running in an isolated environment. So maybe all the OS present things, and this is where the virtualization comes into place, where you have a virtualized environment that's running separate from all the others. So the MLE could be a virtual machine monitor, or it could perhaps just be a simple standalone application. So I'll just give you an example of privileged access. And this actually has had a lot of implications. Is one of the reasons why TPM usage has not progressed as much as it might have, why many of you may not have even been familiar with it. So TPMs, generally speaking, are ship opted out, which means you can't see it, you can't use it. If you buy your machine, you turn it on, you may not even know that there's a TPM there. On each boot, you can go into your BIOS setup. The BIOS allows the user to use physical presence, and this is what I was mentioning earlier. Someone who's physically at the machine can go into the BIOS setup and and manage the TPM. And the two primary things they can do is they can opt in or opt out. So basically, enable or disable the TPM, turn it on, make it visible. And the other thing is clearing all of the keys out of the TPM. The reason they allow this is, you may have one machine. You may have a machine that you want to give to someone else, or you sell, or it's reused, or it has multiple users. You may just want to wipe out all the previous keys so that the next person who has the machine has no access. The danger is, as the questioner asked earlier, anything that you had encrypted with any of the keys that the TPM was protecting is now lost. So you use this physical presence to do these controls. Before the BIOS passes on control to the next entity, it disables physical presence. So any code that's running after the BIOS will not be able to use this, this concept of physical presence. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about attestation. The users of the TPM may use the access control enforced by the TPM to make assertions or to attest to the state of their machine. So, we've done all these great measurements, and the TPM is, behaving based on these measurements. Now I want to go out and prove to some third party that my machine is in a good state. So the TPM can do a signature. It's called quoting. I'm not going to get into any of the details of how that works, but it quotes a set of PCR values. So these are these measuring registers that I talked about earlier. And the TPM can just report back out to someone who wants, here are the current register values in my PCRs. And it's really up to the external world to decide whether those measurements are meaningful. It's simply a way of the TPM saying, this is the state that I'm in now. So, in the scenario where you actually believe that these measurements are meaningful, it's a good way of proving to some third party, to attest that yes, my machine is in a good state. So if the signing key is trusted, and that's a big if, the verifier may trust the state of the machine and may allow certain kinds of access. This is important in particular in the Trusted Network Connect initiatives, where PCs are basically asked to report on their state. So there's a lot of software today, particularly used in corporate environments, where the server asks the client, what version of antivirus are you running? What are all the different things that you have? What's going on with you? And the PC reports back its health. And what Trusted Network Connect is about is saying, how do you really know that the client machine is telling the truth? It could lie about it. And so one of the things, in theory, you can do with the TPM, and in practice, it's very hard. It's not really possible today, is to have the TPM attest to some of these statements that the client machine is making, which would give the server much more confidence. Yes, it really is running that version of antivirus. It really is doing the things that I want it to do. And based on that information, it may grant access to certain resources, let you on the network, that kind of thing. Okay. So this is just to talk about how owner authorization works a little bit. And again, I'm just sort of scratching the surface on all this stuff. So if you have detailed questions, either come talk to me afterwards or ask now. So the TPM owner controls the privacy-sensitive data on the TPM. And what we mean by that is what I alluded to earlier, this notion of unique keys or unique identifiers that are on the platform. So there is a special, unique, per TPM permanent key that's called the endorsement key that is under owner control. And one of the big reasons that the TPM is opted out is the big fear that once that key becomes known, it can be used to always identify your machine. So the use of the endorsement key is very tightly controlled. It's only used in certain circumstances and in certain ways. So in a certain protocol, the owner can authorize the TPM to use the endorsement key to prove that this is actually the TPM that's running on your machine. Interestingly, the way they do it is it decrypts a challenge from some third party. So basically, if I want to know, are you really running with this particular TPM, I will encrypt a message, encrypt some piece of data with the endorsement key for that TPM. And if the TPM and the responder can come back with the value that I decrypted, then you know that it's actually that TPM. It's a clever protocol, although not that novel. But the interesting thing about it is that information actually doesn't prove to anybody else that it is the TPM that you say it is. All it does is prove to the person that challenged you that it's that TPM. So again, there are these barriers being put around privacy and how easy it is to really know which machine you're talking to. And one of the things that the TPM will do when it decrypts this challenge is it'll also identify a particular what's called an attestation identity key. It'll say this key is in fact a TPM key. And what the user can do then is use that AIK as a pseudonym. So in other words, I go and prove to some third party, VeriSign or something, hey, this is a valid TPM key. It's only in this TPM. It's not going to ever get out in software and get used anywhere else. So this is a key you can trust. So VeriSign will provide a certificate for that AIK, and now I can use that as a pseudonym for myself. So I say, this AIK is me, but then if I go to some other person, I don't want to use the same AIK because I don't want them to know that the guy who's buying these books at Amazon is also the one who's working at this company or doing this on Facebook. I want to have separate identities. So each AIK can be used separately. Each individual entity that you're talking with can know, yes, this is a TPM key, but they don't know whether it's the same TPM. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about privacy versus security. And I had a couple of people ask me, are those things really in conflict? You would think, better security could give you better privacy. But, when we're talking about trust again, trust is usually predicated upon identification. So you're not going to trust someone that you don't know. And so by making identification easier, you're enabling trust. But by identifying yourself, almost by definition, you're compromising your privacy. So trusted computing technologies enable this strong identification, but you can't take it back. Once you've identified yourself, particularly if it's a hardware key, you can't go back and say, no, that's not me anymore. So because of all of the issues that were raised, the sensitivity to privacy issues created a number of barriers to adoption. So the TPM opt-in that I talked about, people just couldn't turn it on. And so when there are people writing software, if you make your software require TPM, you're forcing the users to figure out how to get into their BIOS, how to scroll through the menus and select the right things, and I mean, even clever people don't always know how to do this stuff. So it really made it difficult just even to use it at all. And this lack of ubiquity has forced the technology providers to create two parallel solutions in almost every case. So if you have a TPM, then you can do this. And if you don't have a TPM, then you do these other things. And the problem is that gets very expensive. What you really want is a ubiquitous technology, something like SSL, for instance, which has been very successful. And the reason SSL is successful is it's in every single browser. There are certain root certificate authority keys that are built into everybody's browser. And it allows you to get on any machine in the world, pretty much. And when you go to Amazon.com, as long as you check the URL and all these things, you know, hey, I'm really talking to Amazon.com. So, you know, TPM is suffering from the fact that it doesn't have that kind of ubiquity yet. And another issue is that it's technically impossible to use the TPM to prove to everybody that you are who you say you are. So there are just practical challenges of, you know, we want to protect our privacy, okay? But in the scenario where you don't want to be private, you know, which is definitely the case in an enterprise and often the case in a consumer space, the TPM isn't really designed to let you unambiguously identify yourself. So these are sort of some of the challenges, you know, why trusted computing adoption, at least today, has not seen the kind of success that it might have. Yes?
So I'm sitting here thinking that another issue in this sort of space of, you know, well, why is this maybe not adopted here? What you've been saying is sort of you've sort of conflated me and my computer for much of this talk.
Uh-huh.
We're different, right? And so we use, you know, external hard drives that we carry home or something. You know, has there been any thought to, you know, sort of, well, can I encrypt that hard drive and use it in my office, at home, wherever I plug it in, you know, with some small set of computers or a flash drive, you know, something, you know, where we, you know, we use all sorts of different things. And so sort of to directly couple me and my computer isn't quite right?
Yeah, that's right. So there has been a lot of work, you know, in that area. You know, what I've been talking about with the TPM really is saying the fact that it's this computer, is important. You know, but there have been initiatives to put a TPM on a USB drive. You know, so now it's something that you carry around with you, and you know, one of the things you can do, you know, is with the appropriate key management, you know, you put keys in the TPM. It's really a repository for your keys, not the source of your keys. So the keys that go into your TPM, you know that when you encrypt for that TPM, it's only going to that machine. It's not going anywhere else. But you also have that key somewhere else, so you can send it to 5 machines. So the idea is, you know, I have 5 machines that I trust. I get 5 keys, one for each TPM that's on my 5 different platforms. I independently encrypt for those 5 platforms, and now I have that data shared among those 5 platforms, but I know it's only those 5. All right, so I'm running out of time, which is good.
How does that work if you change something on one? Never mind. Okay.
Yeah, we can definitely talk more. So just a couple of takeaways just to summarize. Trusted computing is about improving the security of computing platforms. I argue strongly that we shouldn't confuse the technologies with the purpose to which they might be used. So, you know, those who are for trusted computing or against trusted computing, to me, it's a more, you know, it's a question of, do you want better technologies and better security or not? And the important thing is to find the right ways to use those technologies. And, you know, it's my personal belief, you know, that the market and, you know, and the world figure out ways to use, you know, good technologies the right way. So trusted computing technologies are secure building blocks that allow one party to have better control over certain data or resources and to prevent attackers from doing these bad things. And it's really up to the market to decide, you know, what's good and what's bad. So I'll leave you just with some open questions. You know, I want to stress that it's a relatively new field, you know, 10 years kind of new. But there are conferences about trusted computing. There's a lot of research being done. I would encourage any of you, if you're interested. There's a lot of unknowns here and a lot of interesting things to talk about. So, you know, one of the questions raised, you know, by someone in the back there is, you know, how does this work in a virtualized environment? There's a lot of work being done, but still a number of open questions there. How do you incorporate multi-factor authentication? TPMs today, I talked about the use of passwords. What about if you swipe your finger? What if you have a smart card? So it's interesting to understand how those can be tied together. It's an important research topic to understand how identification can be enabled without compromising privacy. And then the question, of opt-in versus opt-out. Should there be some TPM resources that are always available to sort of gain this ubiquity that will allow it to be used in more ways? So that's all I have to present. So thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes?
Are these principles applicable in the open source software domain, or there are fundamental conflicts between the the ideas of the two? Like, can this be extended to open source platforms? Or?
It absolutely can. There's an initiative. There are a couple of initiatives that have been going on for a while. So there's something called OpenTC, which is an open trusted computing initiative to try to create software and solutions that work with it. IBM also drove something that they called Trousers, which is an open source library for the TSS. So the software that accesses the chips is in fact open source. So there's a lot going on there.
The security of TPM is solely based on the security of the key. We have to protect the key, right? Because everything is encryption based. Now there are sophisticated attacks like side channel analysis, like you can file measurements and those things to break the key. Now, how do you protect your TPM against those attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so that is why the TPM is a security hardware chip. Obviously DPA attacks and that kind of issue, is an important consideration, and that's where some of the vendors differentiate in the marketplace. So there are standards, FIPS 140-2, which doesn't always help, and common criteria. There are certain evaluation levels that are required for a TPM to be certified by the TCG, but there are definitely people working on how do we ensure that the TPM is protecting its keys really strongly. Yeah?
That virtualization question again, it would seem to me that the best place to put your TPM is right directly on the processor chip itself and have your codes there. Basically, serialize your processors with their own private keys or whatever you're going to do there. But the point being that in order to allow virtualization to work out, you need to have control of the machine at the point where the virtualization is done. In effect, embed all the virtualization software right in that device itself. Now, I don't know if anyone's doing that, but is there a way around this that you're aware of, or work around this for allowing virtualization to proceed and also have a TPM of sorts running for each virtual instance?
Yeah, it's a challenging one, and and a lot of it is really based on what the market will bear. Intel actually announced a TPM chip that is part of their processor. They call it I think they call it the iTPM, but it's basically the TPM logic that is exactly what you say, built into their processor. It's not a standalone security chip. The question is, going back to the previous questioner's question, what's the security of that? Are there ways, for attackers to physically go in and get access to these secrets where they might not be able to if it's a discrete hardware chip? So there's a lot of work going on, in terms of how do you, build this really secure core without making it too expensive, especially in this economic environment. How do you build this really strong security that's going to prevent, physical attacks?
Yes.
So you had this EK, I forget what it stood for.
Endorsement key. Yep.
Yeah, but so is that signed by like Intel or the person who makes the TPM or something like that?
Yes. So there are in fact standards, and unfortunately not every TPM vendor did it. But in some cases during the manufacturing process, either the endorsement key would be actually physically placed into the TPM, or it could be generated and burned into non-volatile memory or stored in non-volatile memory in the factory. And the TPM manufacturer would, in fact, provide certificates, signed certificates that say, yes, this is a TPM key.
So I couldn't just implement a TPM in a virtual machine and then, pull out the TPM keys from it and pretend to be a TPM web.
That's right. That's right.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Nice talk.
Thank you.